London, 1874. The gas lamps flicker through a dense yellow fog. You can see your breath inside your own home, and somewhere in the silence between the coughing and the creaking floorboards, you realize winter isn't just cold here, it's cruel. This wasn't the kind of winter you romanticize with snowflakes and fireplaces. This was Victorian London, where warmth was a privilege and survival was a quiet act of defiance. The winters in Victorian London were not simply cold. They were oppressive, heavy, and relentless. Imagine waking up to a world cloaked in an endless grey mist, where sunlight rarely touched the cobblestones and the sky felt as though it hung just above your head. The fog wasn't just atmospheric. It was thick, choking, and full of soot, giving it the nickname London Fog, or more darkly, pea soupers. It rolled in from the Thames and spread through the narrow streets like a ghost, muffling sound and vision. Visibility could drop to just a few feet, and walking down the street felt like moving through a damp wool coat, clinging, heavy, and hard to breathe in. The air was wet, not the crisp cold of a snowy countryside, but a damp, marrow-deep chill that seemed to soak into every layer of your clothing and settle in your bones. It wasn't the kind of cold you could shake off by moving around. It lingered, the kind of cold that made you cough, the kind that crept under doors, through gaps in windows, through the floorboards, and right into your chest. Even inside your home, there was no true escape. The houses were poorly insulated, the walls thin, and the windows drafty. You could sit directly beside a fireplace and still see your breath curling in the air like smoke. Floors were ice cold underfoot, and thick blankets were a necessity, not luxury. The streets themselves were treacherous. Slush turned to ice overnight, and walking became a dangerous activity. Horses slipped, carts overturned, and people often fell, breaking bones or worse. The fog made it nearly impossible to see oncoming traffic, and accidents were common. The street lamps, powered by gas, barely pierced the darkness. Their faint, flickering glow gave just enough light to make shadows seem more sinister. Every corner looked like it held something waiting in the dark, real or imagined, and even the light itself carried the scent of coal and gas, burning sharp in the nose, mixing with the filth of the city and the ever-present dampness of the season. Those who could afford it layered themselves in wool, fur, and leather. Long coats, scarves, gloves, and top hats were essential, but even the wealthiest Londoners couldn't fully escape the cold. It simply became more manageable for them. For most people, though, it was a matter of endurance. Children walked to school through frost, their hands red and raw, their breath puffing in clouds in front of them. Shopkeepers wore gloves indoors. Workers in warehouses and factories toiled in unheated spaces, their fingers numb and stiff, tools clanging from cold hands. The sounds of winter were muted but distinct. The crunch of boots on frozen ground, the hiss of gas lamps, the crackle of a coal fire, the dripping of water from eaves as snow began to melt briefly before freezing again, the distant clop of hooves echoing off stone walls through the fog, and always the cough. The persistent wet cough of bronchitis, of influenza, of lungs weakened by cold, coal smoke and city air. There was no central heating, no warm cars to climb into, no electric blankets or space heaters. Keeping warm was a constant effort. Fires had to be stoked, coals shoveled, ashes cleaned, and coal wasn't cheap. Many families had to ration their supply, choosing to light the fire only in the evening, or to warm just one room of the house. In poorer households, the entire family would huddle in kitchen or parlor, wrapped in blankets, sleeping near the fire to survive the night. Bedrooms were iceboxes, water pitchers froze, windows frosted over from the inside, and the cold found its way into every crevice of life. Even the fog itself was deadly. The soot and smoke from thousands of chimneys mixed with the mist, creating a poisonous brew that seeped into the lungs of everyone who breathed it. It was not uncommon for people to fall ill simply from being outside too long. The fog could last for days, sometimes weeks, and it changed the way the city lived. People moved slower. Conversations were shorter. Everything became quieter, as though the city itself had drawn in for warmth, shivering beneath its grey veil. But it wasn't just the physical cold that made these winters brutal. It was the atmosphere, the psychological weight of a world with so little light, so little color, so much dampness and soot and silence. It was a season of endurance. For the rich, it was an inconvenience. For the poor, it was a threat. The kind of threat that could kill you slowly, without drama or warning. Just a chill that turned into a cough, a slip on the ice that became a broken hip, a night without enough coal that became a fever that wouldn't break. And yet, London carried on. People still moved through the streets, bundled tightly, heads down. Carriages still rattled over the stone roads. Markets still opened. The city didn't stop. It simply grew quieter, slower, grayer. Like it was holding its breath, waiting for spring. In the heart of winter, the daily struggle to stay warm in Victorian London was as constant as the chiming of the church bells. There was no central heating, no radiators quietly humming to life at the flick of a switch. Warmth had to be earned. One coal bucket at a time. The primary source of heat was the fireplace, and even that luxury was limited. Most homes had just one, maybe two at most, meant to heat an entire house with multiple rooms and several people. The fire had to be carefully built and maintained, the coal rationed wisely. Stretch across the bitter season, coal was king, but it came at a price. For many lower-income families, it was an expense that required sacrifice, bread or warmth, light or fire. Often, they bought coal in small quantities, just enough to last the day or night. There were street vendors who sold it by the scoop, their carts dusted with black soot, faces smudged with the grime of their trade. Some families would scavenge for wood scraps, old furniture, anything flammable. Children were sent out to collect kindling, often barefoot, their fingers stiff with cold. Inside, the fire would be lit only in the evening when the family gathered together, wrapping themselves in worn shawls and patched-up blankets, huddled close to the hearth like moths to a flame. Even in wealthier households, warmth was a challenge. Rooms not in regular use were shut off entirely. Curtains were drawn, draught stoppers placed at doorways, and thick rugs laid down on cold wooden floors. Hot water bottles were filled and tucked into beds an hour before sleep. Servants would rise before dawn to light the fires, the cold biting at their hands as they worked through their morning tasks in near freezing kitchens. Even so, heat was temporary and localized. A room might be cozy for an hour or two, but the warmth never lasted, and the cold never truly left. Windows were a constant source of chill. They were single, paned, rattling in their frames, frosted over with the breath of those inside. Condensation would collect and freeze in the corners. Icicles sometimes formed on the inside, catching the weak morning light. People stuffed rags into the cracks, lined the sills with newspaper, or hung heavy drapes to try and hold the cold at bay. But it seeped in regardless, a silent invader that made itself at home. Water pipes were another enemy. The plumbing systems of the time were primitive and poorly protected. In the dead of winter, pipes froze solid. Taps stopped working. Toilets became unusable. Buckets of water had to be fetched or melted over the fire. Indoor plumbing, where it existed, became unreliable at best. In many poorer homes, there was no indoor plumbing at all, and families relied on shared outdoor pumps or wells. Waking up to fetch water in the freezing dark, breaking through a crust of ice to reach what lay beneath, was a daily reality. Food preparation became a battle of its own. Kitchens were cold, pantries colder. Bread went stale faster. Butter turned to stone. Meats had to be cooked quickly to avoid spoilage, and produce, if there was any, wilted from the constant dampness. There were no refrigerators, so food was stored in cool cellars. Larders, often the coldest rooms in the house. Cooking meant standing close to the fire or stove, hands red and raw from the cold, stirring pots while breath hung visibly in the air. The body itself became a battleground. Fingers lost feeling, toes turned purple, skin cracked and bled from dryness. Frostbite was not uncommon, especially for children and the elderly. People wrapped themselves in layers, woolen undershirts, corsets, flannel petticoats, multiple pairs of stockings, gloves, hats, scarves. Even indoors, one never truly undressed. Nightwear was thick, and people often wore hats to bed. Sharing a bed was not only about affection or space, it was survival. Shared body heat was one of the few defenses against the creeping chill of the night. For those with jobs that took them outside, like lamplighters, chimney sweeps, or street vendors, the cold was a constant companion. Many worked long hours in bitter winds, with numb hands and soaked shoes. Frost collected on their eyelashes. Breath came in sharp, painful bursts. Some warmed their hands over open flame barrels on the street corners, while others carried small, portable tins filled with hot coals known as hand warmers. But even those gave only fleeting relief. The cold always returned. Churches and community halls sometimes opened their doors to the poorest residents, offering warm soup and a few hours of shelter, but these were limited and overcrowded. Workhouses were similarly packed during the winter months. People would brave humiliation and strict discipline just to escape the freezing outdoors. The cold blurred social lines, but only in discomfort. It did not equalize. The poor still bore the worst of it, often in silence, often with no real hope for reprieve. Winter was a season of calculated survival. It wasn't about comfort or beauty. It was about making it through another night, another week, another month, until the thaw. Every action was shaped by the cold, how people moved, how they dressed, how they ate, how they slept. Fire was not just a tool. It was a lifeline. Every ember mattered, every bit of warmth was cherished, and despite the challenges, people endured because they had no other choice. For the poor in Victorian London, winter was not simply uncomfortable. It was a quiet battle for survival that many did not win. The cold season revealed the starkest inequalities between the classes. While the wealthy might complain of drafts and frozen pains, the poor faced a far crueler winter reality: exposure, hunger, sickness, and the bone. Deep acre being forgotten. The city did not stop for its suffering. The carriages still rolled, the factories still ran, the wealthy still gathered at balls and concerts. But beneath the surface, in alleyways, cellars, and makeshift shelters, the poor tried to hold on against the cold with whatever scraps of warmth and dignity they could muster. Many of London's poor lived in overcrowded tenements, crumbling buildings packed with multiple families in rooms barely large enough for 2 people. The walls were damp, the ceilings low, and the windows either broken or ill-fitted. Cold air blew through the gaps without resistance. Mold bloomed in corners. Rats and insects took up residence alongside the families. These homes had little to no heating. A single small fireplace, if it existed, rarely saw a flame. There was rarely money for coal, let alone enough to last through the long winter nights. Often, the fire remained empty, black and cold, while entire families huddled together for warmth, under piles of thin, worn blankets, wrapped in old coats and sharing body heat as their only defense. Children suffered the most. Many were barefoot, even in winter, walking the icy streets in threadbare clothes, trying to sell flowers, matches, or newspapers to passers-by. Their hands were red and cracked, their cheeks windburnt, their eyes heavy with fatigue. These children were not in school, they worked. They had to. Some swept chimneys, others ran errands or carried goods. The streets were harsh, slick with ice, filled with smoke, noise, and the occasional cruelty of those who saw their poverty as a nuisance. Yet they moved through it every day, hungry and cold, hoping for a coin or crust of bread to bring home. Many had no home at all. The homeless population swelled during winter, as jobs grew scarcer and the weather more unforgiving. Men and women slept beneath bridges, in doorways, or curled in corners of narrow alleys with only newspapers and each other for insulation. Some begged in front of churches, others walked the streets aimlessly just to keep their blood moving. Death from exposure was common, especially among the old and the very young. The Thames, grey and swollen with rain, claimed its share of lives in the form of frostbitten limbs, suicide, or the unlucky who fell in while seeking shelter along its banks. The workhouses, dreaded but necessary, became a grim lifeline for many. They were places of last resort, where the poor were housed and fed. In exchange for hard labor and complete surrender of freedom, families were often separated, men to one side, women to another, children placed elsewhere. The food was plain, the rules strict, and the routine dehumanizing. Yet during the winter, these workhouses filled quickly. People would line up in the freezing dark, hoping to be admitted, not because they wanted to be there, but because a warm floor, a bowl of gruel, and a roof over their head was preferable to dying alone in the street. Charity organizations and churches did what they could. Soup kitchens handed out bowls of watery stew or bread to shivering lines of the hungry. Clothing drives provided second-hand coats and boots, often full of holes, but still better than nothing. Volunteers moved through the poorest districts offering blankets, tending to the sick, and lighting fires in communal spaces. But these acts of kindness were not enough to meet the overwhelming need. The cold always outnumbered the warm. The laboring poor who still held jobs found little comfort either. Many worked outdoors or in unheated buildings, construction sites, markets, stables, warehouses. Their wages were meager and often docked for illness or absence, so they kept working, even when their lungs burned with every breath and their joints ached from the chill. Factories were not heated for the comfort of workers, only for the preservation of materials. Men and women operated machinery with stiff, frozen fingers. If accident happened, and they often did, there was little sympathy or rest. Street sellers fared no better. They stood for hours in the biting wind, calling out their goods, roasted chestnuts, meat pies, ribbons, buttons. Their breath clouded in front of them, their teeth chattered, and their bodies trembled. Yet if they didn't sell, they didn't eat. Cold was an accepted companion, tolerated but never welcomed. It was in their bones, their clothes, their dreams. Despite the hardship, there were flickers of resilience. Families shared what little they had. Neighbors looked after one another. When someone found discarded firewood, they shared it. When someone had soup, they offered a spoonful. Laughter still surfaced, often dark or ironic, as a defense against the bitter reality. Songs were sung, games invented, stories told. And sometimes, just sometimes, the cold receded long enough for a child to play, or a mother to smile, or an old man to remember warmth not from fire, but from love. But make no mistake, the cold of a Victorian winter was a weapon. It punished the poor most of all, not because they deserved it, but because they had no shield against it. No fur coats, no grand fireplaces, no cushioned carriages to carry them through the frost. Only grit, hope, and the company of others in the same struggle. In winter, London was a city of two worlds, one that curled up in luxury, and another that crouched in alleyways and shivered beneath the same pale, unfeeling sky. The cold in Victorian London was not just an environmental inconvenience, it was a silent accomplice to disease and death. Every winter, as the temperature dropped and fog thickened over the city's narrow, overcrowded streets, sickness bloomed like mold in the dark corners of homes and alleyways. The chill didn't just cause discomfort, it weakened the body's defenses, opened the door for infection, and allowed even common illnesses to become deadly. In the wealthier parts of the city, doctors might be summoned to homes and prescribe rest broths and brandy. But in the slums, where families slept in damp rooms with no heat and very little food, illness was often a death sentence wrapped in silence. Bronchitis and pneumonia were among the most common winter killers. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. The wet, heavy air filled with coal smoke made it difficult for anyone to breathe, but for those already weakened by hunger or age, each breath could become a battle. Coughing echoed through hallways, through the thin walls of boarding houses, through tenements packed with too many bodies and too little space. Mothers held their feverish children close, trying to warm them with their own bodies, praying the illness would pass. Sometimes it did. Many times it didn't. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, thrived in the cold. It was a slow, wasting disease that took months, even years, to kill. But winter accelerated its grip. The coughing became more violent. Blood was spat into rags, and those infected faded before their families' eyes. Workhouses were filled with the sound of hacking lungs, and hospitals overflowed. But there was no true cure, only the hope that the next spring would come soon enough to save the sick. Influenza swept through neighborhoods like a ghost, infecting entire households in days. Without antibiotics or vaccines, treatment was limited to rest, warm fluids, and hope. But rest was a luxury. Poor families could not afford to stop working. A father with a fever still dragged himself to the docks. A mother with aching bones still washed clothes or sold flowers on the street. And so the virus spread from one body to another, wearing them down until even the strongest collapsed. Cholera was another spectre, though its worst outbreaks often occurred in warmer months. Still, winter did not guarantee safety. The cramped living conditions and lack of clean water made disease ever present. Many homes shared one outdoor toilet, often overflowing or frozen solid. Buckets were emptied into the street, waste flowed into the Thames, and drinking water was contaminated. Though progress was being made to improve sanitation, the poorest districts remained breeding grounds for filth and infection. Cold did not purify, it simply concealed the rot beneath layers of frost. Hospitals in Victorian London were grim places. They were overcrowded, underfunded, and often unsanitary. Beds were packed close together, blankets thin and often shared between patients. Heating was scarce. Nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, but the sheer volume of illness and the lack of effective treatments meant that many patients never left. The hospital was a place of last resort, entered only when one had no other option, and too often it was where people went to die. The death toll in winter was not always counted in dramatic spikes, but in the steady trickle of names added to burial records. Death became a quiet, everyday occurrence. Undertakers moved quietly through the streets with their black carriages. Black cloth hung over doorways, bells tolled. Coffins were carried down icy steps, mourners walking slowly behind, bundled in black wool. In the poorest districts, paupers' funerals became a daily routine. Bodies were wrapped in cloth and buried without ceremony in mass graves. Sometimes entire families would vanish within the span of a single season. The psychological weight of winter's toll was heavy. Grief piled atop exhaustion. People learned not to linger on death too long. There was no time. Survival demanded constant effort, and yet the memory of who had been lost, siblings, parents, friends, clung like the damp to walls and hearts alike. Stories were told in whispers around the hearth. Names were carved into frost-covered headstones, and the living went on because they had no other choice. Even for those who did not fall ill, winter left marks. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. The lack of sunlight caused depression, what some called melancholy or nerves. The darkness stretched on, broken only by brief glimpses of pale daylight that disappeared by mid-afternoon. Work started and ended in darkness. People grew quiet. Eyes became dull. Spirit flagged. Some turned to alcohol, to laudanum, to anything that dulled the sharp edge of winter's bite. And yet, through all this, the city endured. Winter did not defeat London. It merely reminded its people how fragile life could be. Doctors continued their rounds, nurses wiped brows, neighbors watched over each other, and somewhere a child always laughed even through the cough. Death walked the streets, yes, but so did stubbornness, faith, and the will to live. The fog would lift eventually, the sun would return, the frost would melt, and the church bells would ring again. Not mourning, but for life. Until then they waited, wrapped in scarves, surrounded by silence, waiting for warmth to return. Even amid the bleakness of Victorian winters, amid the fog, the hunger, the death, there were glimmers of warmth. Not from the coal fires, which were rationed and flickering, nor from the thick wool coats worn only by those who could afford them, but from the resilience and spirit of people who refused to surrender to the cold entirely. In the darkest season of the year, Londoners, rich and poor alike, clung to what little joy they could find, and sometimes that meant creating their own warmth through tradition, gathering, and small acts of comfort. For all its hardship, winter was also the season of togetherness. Families, even the most impoverished ones, found reasons to gather closely, not just out of necessity, but from instinct. The fire, when it could be lit, was a central point around which everything revolved. Children would sit close, playing games with scraps of paper or buttons, while adults told stories, sang quietly, or simply rested their eyes. The glow of the hearth, no matter how dim, brought a kind of peace. It was not just about physical heat. It was about the feeling of being close, of not being alone in the cold. Christmas, in particular, became a season that brought light to otherwise dreary months. Though modern ideas of a traditional Christmas were still forming during the Victorian era, it was this period, thanks in part to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's influence, that many customs we now recognize began to take hold. Christmas trees decorated with handmade ornaments, stockings hung by the hearth, carols sung in the streets. All of it added a layer of magic to the otherwise brutal season. For a few days, even the poorest families tried to create something special. A goose might be shared among several households. Oranges were considered precious gifts. Children might receive a small toy carved from wood, a piece of candy, or even just a warm embrace and the rare sound of laughter. Charity, too, took on a more visible form during winter. It was a season when the wealthy were reminded, through church sermons, literature, and public conscience, of their obligation to the poor. Stories like Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol had a profound impact on the Victorian mindset, encouraging acts of generosity and compassion. Some wealthy families distributed food or clothing. Others sponsored soup kitchens or sent servants out with baskets of coal and bread to be delivered quietly to those in need. While these gestures did not erase the harshness of winter, they did provide momentary relief, and in some cases, a reason to hope. Inside wealthier homes, the rituals of comfort were more elaborate but no less rooted in the desire for warmth and safety. Parlors were decorated with evergreen branches and holly, windows adorned with red ribbons and candles. Families played parlor games, read aloud from books, and hosted musical evenings by firelight. The sound of a piano in winter, soft and nostalgic, became a kind of emotional balm. Tea was poured endlessly, spiced cakes served, and brandy warmed the hands and the spirits. Children wrote letters to Father Christmas. Adults exchanged handwritten cards. And at the center of it all was the idea that winter, for all its cruelty, could still be beautiful in its own way. But perhaps the most meaningful warmth came not from tradition, or charity, or even fire, but from the resilience and inner strength of the people themselves. In the face of illness, of grief, of poverty and fog and endless grey skies, people endured, they adapted, they invented ways to create joy in small, subtle forms. A mother might save coins all year to buy her child a single sweet. A neighbor might share a crust of bread with someone even poorer. Children built tiny sleds from broken furniture and raced down snowy hillsides, their laughter rising above the rooftops. Life continued not in grand acts, but in little sparks of humanity that refused to be extinguished. Books played a role too. In many homes, reading became a winter ritual. Whether it was the Bible, a dog-eared novel, or a volume of poetry, words became a way to escape the cold reality outside. Stories transported people to faraway lands, sunny countrysides, and warmer hearts. They reminded the reader that time moved forward, that seasons changed, and that spring would eventually come again. The church, too, provided more than spiritual guidance. During winter, it was often a place of literal warmth. Many churches opened their doors to the cold and the desperate. They offered shelter, soup, sermons, and song. Midnight Mass on Christmas Eve was a tradition that cut across class boundaries. Candles flickered, voices rose in song, and for that hour at least there was a sense of unity, of shared endurance against the dark. Even in prisons, workhouses, and hospitals, efforts were sometimes made to mark the season. Extra blankets were distributed. A small tree might be set up in the hall. Nurses sang to the patients. Guards turned a blind eye to whispered carols. In these places of suffering, any gesture of kindness stood out all the more starkly against the cold that surrounded them. So while winter in Victorian London was undoubtedly brutal, filled with hardship, illness, and death, it was also a time when the best parts of humanity could shine through the cracks. A time when warmth was not just a matter of temperature, but of spirit. It was found in the sharing of a meal, the lighting of a single candle, the sound of a lullaby. In a freezing room, the city might have been wrapped in fog and frost, but within the walls of its homes, behind the curtains and beneath the blankets, there were still people trying to live, to love, and to hope. That, in its own quiet way, was the greatest defiance of all.